All right, folks. So I already covered the 3 legendary dragon aspect core cards that were revealed at BlizzCon Online, and now I'm doubling back to get the rest of the core set cards that were revealed. Some of which are totally new cards, like Vanessa Vancleef here behind me. Others of which are rebalanced versions of cards we already know and sometimes love. So let's review all these new core set additions. So Vanessa Vancleef, for instance, here is a 2-mana 2/3 with combo. Add a copy of the last card your opponent played to your hand. So you can wait for that key moment when your opponent plays some super awesome high-powered legendary, and then you can use Vanessa to get a copy of that. And then you have a nice little bonus, super awesome high-powered legendary for only 2 mana, and you could even like shadow step this and get multiple copies. So there's some real potential here to get some great resources. And of course, there's also like Burgle style potential here as well, where you're getting cards from other classes. Maybe that's triggering other Burgle or Thief style effects, assuming those exist in standard format moving forward, which makes Vanessa a pretty cool tool. Value generator and Thief activator. Those are both things Rogue historically has enjoyed, sometimes only for fun, sometimes for power output as well. Now, that said, I still think there are some checks on the power level here for Vanessa Vancleef. Notably, of course, is if she ever becomes popular enough, your opponent might really just be able to play around her if they have, like, you know, a big, awesome 8-mana legendary they don't want you to take. They can maybe just play it first and then play some garbage card afterwards to deny you the Vanessa Vancleef opportunity. That won't always be possible, right? Sometimes they'll have to spend their full mana, you know, using that AoE card. You get their Soul Mirror, Twisting Nether or something, right? But other times, they might be able to play around it. So that's one possible denial here for Vanessa. On top of that, this is a combo card, so there is sometimes some awkwardness if you're perhaps looking to play the card that you copy immediately. So for instance, your opponent plays a Tyrion Fordring, and you really, really want that Tyrion, but he's 8 mana, you only have 10 mana, you have to play something to combo Vanessa. Maybe you gotta spend 1 or 2 mana to get the combo down. By the time you do that, and you play the 2 mana for Vanessa, you're not gonna have enough mana to play Tyrion immediately. So there will occasionally be instances where the fact that you have to play her after something else stacks up just a little bit too much mana tax to get that resource down in the same turn, which won't always matter. Sometimes you'll be happy to play Tyrion next turn, but on occasion it could be a little bit awkward at the very least. So all in all, the question is taking your opponent's cards or just copying your opponent's cards really noteworthy enough? How often is that going to provide a real high roll opportunity? Sometimes it's just not going to be that great. A lot of turns, it's just nothing you're going to want to take. So I think there will be some downtime for this card. It'll sit in hand a long time, and some games it may not really make much of an impact at all. Other instances, you'll just take something simple for it just to get a 2-mana 2/3 card down on the board, which is fine, but not as exciting perhaps as other plays that exist. So I think only really decks that are able to especially utilize this effect via some sort of Thief synergy, combo synergies, will make it worth it. Whereas, you know, standard tempo style rogues or really aggressive rogues that we tend to see lately won't really have much use case for Vanessa Vancleef here, because ultimately she's kind of playing to your opponent's game plan as opposed to your own. And Rogue often has a pretty good game plan that they're trying to initiate. They don't need to rely on their opponent's stuff often, other than those Thief decks, which is where I think Vanessa could be cool. So next up here is Overlord Runthak, a 5-mana 3/6 neutral legendary with Rush, and it reads, whenever this attacks, give +1/+1 to all minions in your hand. So a Handbuff card. And, you know, we've seen a lot of Handbuff effects in Hearthstone, and rarely are they ever any good. So many failed Handbuff style cards. It seems like either Blizzard doesn't want them to be good, or the numbers never really make sense, because Handbuff, it never takes off. It just doesn't seem to work. You want those onboard buffs because those stats are in play immediately. Now, that said, I do think Overlord Runthak is more aggressive or pushed a little bit when it comes to his base card. In other words, usually when you play Handbuff cards, you're sacrificing a ton of tempo. You're not usually doing much that turn. You're kind of hoping to play for future turns, and it takes a long time for those Handbuff stats to make an impact. With Runthak, that might be okay because you're playing a card here that's still got some immediacy. It's still impacting the board, and it has multiple turn upside as well. If it gets to attack multiple times, things can really go nuts. So I think that helps. Like, you're not just totally giving up your turn. He's taking a trade into a 3/3 or something, and that's going to help you keep up while you start putting those hand buff stats into play. And of course, if you have a deck that's utilizing a lot of rush synergies, you can kind of see a rush package coming together already in Forged in the Barrens for classes like Warrior, perhaps, or maybe others as well. Then with Rush, of course, the hand buff stats are even easier to put into play faster, so that could really help as well. So, I don't think this goes in every deck. It's not like a general case legendary. The stat upside is just not meaningful enough for this card, but anybody that's starting to use Rush synergies, anybody that has minions in hand that really benefit from stats, it starts to scale. So will this and Blade Master Samuro be a little package you toss into Warrior? I think that's a possibility. I don't think this card's going to define the meta. It's not going to make anybody crazy, but I could see it finding its way into some deck here and there. Moving on here to the Novice Zapper for Shaman, a 1-mana 3/2 Zappy Boy here with spell damage +1 and overload of 1. So in total, you're spending 2 mana on this card, but of course, you're getting a really nicely statted 1-drop, Flame Imp stat line, and it's also got spell damage as well, which is huge upside. So I think there would be instances and decks that are happy to play this on turn 1 as a Flame Imp or Blazing Battle Mage style card where you're just creating a ton of pressure, and maybe you follow it up with another one of these on turn 2, and that's just your early game push, and your opponent can't answer it, you chip a ton of damage. I think there's also utility where that same deck or other decks that care about spell damage get a really cheap 1 mana, 1 spell damage card. Typically, for minions, you have to spend 2 mana to get 1 spell damage in the past historically. So this is just a cheap way where you're happy to do it on the overload. Doesn't matter because you're winning the game now. You're swinging the game now thanks to this spell damage, and you're happy that it's just cheaper. It's 2 mana total, sure, but if the game ends now, or you define the game now, who cares about next turn? Doesn't matter. You're making your game-winning move at the moment. So that really cheap, flexible spell damage seems impactful for some decks. Big body on turn 1 seems crazy good for some aggro decks. I think that makes this a really flexible card that fits across multiple archetypes. The stats here and the numbers just make a lot of sense to me. There's a little bit of curve overload punish sometimes, but deck building can usually fix that to make sure you have reliable 1-drops to make your curve work out. So I think this looks like a really strong card with some very big numbers for its cost. All right, moving on to the Felsoul Jailer. I love the look of this card for some reason, but I don't know if I love the card itself. It's a new Warlock 5-mana 4/6 demon with a battle cry. Your opponent discards a minion and then Death Rattle. Return the minion that was discarded. So in theory, the way I think this card's supposed to work, or the upside that you're supposed to realize is, you play this on turn 5, your opponent has some 5 or 6 drop they're looking to play, and you hope that your Felsoul Jailer discards whatever card your opponent was hoping to play, and basically you mess up their curve, and you kind of stall out the thing they were looking to do, whether that's like a high-powered Jandis Barov that you want to stall out and make sure they can't get it down on time, or some combo piece you just want to keep away for a turn or something. Or you just want to make them have to answer this minion, and that could really disrupt them too. They got to use some weird removal card. They start floating mana. Next turn, they float a mana. Start gaining these small incremental efficiency and tempo advantages off of a card like Felsoul Jailer. And that's fine, I guess. Remember that you're not like ripping their card away forever with something like Dirty Rat, where you pull it and then you kill it and you like break their combo. They're probably usually getting the card back. They're just discarding it for a while until this thing dies. So, unless this is like the final card you play as you start to end the game, or you silence or transform this so that they can't get the card back, it's not really that disruptive so much as it's like a stall card instead. And I don't think this card feels great to transform or silence. It's got a pretty good body. It kind of costs a lot, so using it as a utility card feels like it might be too pricey. Dirty Rat, was 2 mana. That was great. It's flexible, right? A lot of those disruption cards for Warlock. There's been a handful that transform your opponent's cards, etc. They've been cheap, so you can kind of squeeze them into turns. This is a bit more of a commitment. So I don't think you're going to get sneaky with it and like try to evolve it or whatever, and that's not something Warlock's great at anyway. The standard use case, I think, is how this is going to be used most of the time, like 95% of the time. And I'm not that excited about the standard use case. Because you're not always going to hit the Jandis Bear off. Sometimes you're going to like discard their 1-drop. And they're like, okay, whatever, I'm just going to play Jandis. This thing's going to die eventually or whatever anyway. I'm going to get that 1-drop back. I don't really need it in the first place. So you're not going to hit key minions. You know, your opponent has 3 or 4 minions in hand. How often is it going to line up perfectly for the curve and actually be disruptive? And in the meantime, you're just getting a 5-mana 4/6, which nothing to write home about. It's fine, but not a play that's getting you excited. So how often is this like stall or disruption plan meaningful enough that it's worth it for you to run an otherwise Spectral Knight worse kind of card that's just a 4/6 that does a tiny thing for a couple turns and nothing else? To me, it seems like it's not going to be worth it. Now, that said, we may see some like opponent-based discard synergy stuff where, you know, it's like, oh, get a copy of any cards your opponent discards or something. And this has that like extra twinge of value or it gives you something back by discarding your opponent's cards. So because this is a bit of a novel effect or, you know, doing something a little bit of a different twist than normal, that does open up lines. So it's a big enough effect to consider this good, but in a vacuum at a base level, it just doesn't look strong enough to me. It's just got that tiny bit of hope that something shows up to really support it. So moving on here to Priest card, Thrive in the Shadows. 2-mana spell here. It's a shadow spell type, and it discovers a spell from your deck. Now that may sound a lot like Shadow Visions, I think it was called. But that card discovered a copy of a spell of your deck. So that's why back in the day you could get like 4 Mind Blasts in Priest and just like own your opponent. This is just discovering the spell itself. So it's like drawing it out of your deck. So this is really more about cycle and tutor style effects where you're trying to find something specific instead of a card that's, you know, creating copies of stuff and finding something specific. So I don't think it's as good as that card of old, but it still has a lot of utility as a tutor spell. So it can help you find a specific spell, like some like build around thing that's really important for your deck, Thune pieces, a removal spell, find that Soul Mirror in Desperation to make sure you can clear board. Those are all great. It's a bit like tracking for Hunter, right? And you just slam that tracking, find the card you need, but it's pulling from an even more specific set of cards, which is nice, because you can really narrow down the likelihood of finding something that's going to solve your problems. And in fact, you can even build your deck to support that, where your spells are all kind of doing something perfect for you. Now, I will say Cleric of Scales has had the same effect. For 1 mana on a body, you have to have a dragon for that one to work, but it hasn't like blown anybody's mind from a power level standpoint. It's solid in dragon decks. I don't think this is going to blow your mind either. I think it's a solid tutor card for decks that need to do that. It's going to be great when it's generated randomly off of all the stuff Priest uses to generate cards. There'll be moments where it's a big hit, but not every deck's going to have to cut a spot for this one, right? It's just not good enough, I think, that every deck is running it. But cheap spell Priest decks, some control decks, and any sort of combo or shenanigan deck that's looking for specific cards, maybe even like Cthulhu decks, could use this one. So I do think it'll get played. I just don't think it's going to be a fundamental thing that like changes the class or really opens up a lot of different lines of play. So basically a solid card, just not an amazing one. All right, so now we're done with the new cards. We're going to move into the cards we know that have been rebalanced. For instance, Lightning Storm here now deals guaranteed 3 damage as opposed to the range of 2 to 3 damage. And what a great change. I always hated Lightning Storms, like just unneeded randomness. The RNG element that Shaman got in the Classic and Basic set always felt so frustrating to me. So yeah, this is an awesome change, and it really does increase the power level of the card. That 3 damage deal 3 or 3 mana deal 3 damage spot is a pretty good place to live. That's going to make it very efficient at answering a lot of early boards. and sometimes those like 3 health things do sneak in by the time you need to use that lightning storm. So just make sure it's going to connect and actually do the job, which it needs to do when you're looking at this pretty hefty overload on lightning storm. It's still a very punishing overload. So of course, historically, Lightning Storm has made it into Shaman decks. It's been less prominent as of late. Shaman has a lot of other AoE tools. Even cards like Landslide now might still just be better than Lightning Storm. So I don't know if this is enough to make Lightning Storm a great card that's being played in control or slower Shaman decks, but it's slightly more likely and certainly better than it was. So happy to see this buff. I still think Lightning Storm remains a fairly middling card for Shaman just because it has a lot of competition and that overload is so punishing. But man, what a great change. We've also got a change here to Feral Spirit. Now it's only going to have an overload of 1 instead of an overload of 2. And you know what? I think this makes Feral Spirit a really interesting card. 3 mana for 2/2/3s is pretty solid, particularly because they have taunt that can be very problematic for aggro decks to deal with. It can also be a decent way to build your own board if you're trying to play a little bit more aggressively. And the overload here, I don't think adds up as much. If you play this on curve, you still get another 3 mana play right afterwards. You can play another Feral Spirit, and there's a lot of great 3-drop options in Hearthstone. Typically a pretty important mana point for a lot of decks, so you can consistently follow this up, I'm sure, with other great plays. Also just makes this easier to squeeze into a mid-game turn, that turn 5, 6, 7 turn. You can play this and do other things without really breaking your future turns, which is nice. So I think this becomes an interesting tool. Again, it may not make its way into every deck, but keep an eye out for this one. I think the overload in the past just made Feral Spirit so hard to play. Going from a 3-mana turn to a 2-mana turn was tough, and 2 mana really cuts off those mid-game turns. Whereas this overload of 1 won't do that, and it still might enable overload synergies as well. So pretty intriguing little spell now, I think, with this nice change. All right, so next up for Shaman here is Earth Elemental. And unfortunately for Earth Elemental, I don't think its change is enough, unlike perhaps our last 2 cards. Doesn't feel as meaningful. Its overload is now going to be 2 instead of 3. And I still think 2 overloads really hard to work with sometimes. It just makes your turns feel really choked up on mana. And at the end of the day, to be honest, I don't know if a 5-mana 7/8 taunt is exciting enough. It's clearly fine. There's a lot of instances you play that, you're pretty happy. It slows down some aggro decks who don't have any single target removal. But, you know, at a total cost of 7 mana, it's still hard to get Earth Elemental down. I mean, compared to like Void Drinker for Warlock, right? Void Drinker's the same size minion at 5 mana. It's in Soul Fragment decks. I don't feel like it's ruining my day usually. I don't feel like Void Drinker's giving me enormous problems. And I don't think Earth Elemental will either. And Earth Elemental has an even more punishing downside than Void Drinker. So for me, Earth Elemental, you know, I just don't think it gets there. There's obviously elemental synergy options, but I think usually you want your elementals to be more flexible, cheaper, have some kind of actual elemental synergy effect if that were to be a thing again. So this card just doesn't seem like it's going to be good enough with this change. Just a little too subtle. Moving on here to Menagerie Warden coming back. I always thought this card was a lot of fun to play with, but could just never make it work. It is now a 5-mana minion instead of a 6-mana minion. I actually don't know what the old Menagerie Warden looked like. 1 second. I think it was a 6-mana 5/5, wasn't it? Let's see. Yeah, it was a 6-mana 5/5. And now it's a 5-mana 4/4. And you really don't care about the stats on this base minion, so I think it's totally fine that it lost stats. It's more important that it's cheaper so that you can copy that cool beast that you want to copy. And Druid already got an awesome new beast with the big rush minion in Forged in the Barrens. It seems like they could get more support there as well. So this is cool, right? It's a 4/4 plus some potential big bonus. And if you push to 10 mana, there's some great 5-mana beasts you could play alongside this, like Twilight Runner. So this 5-mana spot's really important, perhaps, for that exact mana lineup. And that's pretty cool, I have to say. That said, there's still the challenge that you typically are going to have to play this card the same turn as you play your beast. And that's just a big lockup of your mana. Like just spending 10 mana like that or a little less, whatever, is still a big commitment and may not provide the reactivity or swing necessary to make it feel like a good play. if you can leave a big beast behind on board, you play like a winged guardian, even though that's rotating out. You guys get the idea. And, that'd be great if you could follow it up with a menagerie warden on the next turn. But that's not that likely, right? Usually minions die. And if they don't, you're doing great things anyway. Maybe this doesn't even help. It's a bit more win more in that regard. But at 5 mana, at least it has a slightly higher chance of connecting and being that flexible tool that you can squeeze into a turn. I still think it'd be amazing if it's something like 4 mana, but of course, that might be a little bit too strong. That said, I hope this is an encouraging sign that they're printing some Beast Druid support. I still really want to make that deck work. And I think Menagerie Warden could be a small step towards that success, but it's certainly not enough on its own to push Beast Druid into anything being super competitive. All right, so now let's do some quick reviews. Vanessa Vancleef is a 3-star card. Overlord Runthak is a 3-star card. Novice Zapper is a 4-star card. Felsoul Jailer is a 2-star card. Thrive in the Shadows is a 3-star card. Lightning Storm is a 2-star card. Feral Spirit is a 4-star card. Earth Elemental is a 2-star card. Menagerie Warden is a 3-star card. And that wraps it up, everybody, for the core set review number 2. So excited to see these new cards, man. I think it's really cool. Clearly, the art in these and everything is like up to the normal standards we expect for Hearthstone, but they're only going to be in standard format for a year. I mean, some Hearthstone cards are only in standard format for what, like 16 months or something. But, usually it's well over a year, and in many cases, like 2 full years. So the fact that these are getting less playtime and they're going to be free for everybody, but they're still getting all the attention that they deserve, I think it's a pretty cool sign. That's good news. I thought these might be like an afterthought or might not have a lot of work put into them, but I don't think that's the case. So not, in love with every mechanic here necessarily, but still some really neat, nifty looking cards. That said, share your thoughts on all these below. What do you think is going to be nuts? What do you think is going to be terrible? I want to hear it all. That said, thanks much for watching. Stay tuned for more reviews as soon as we can get them. And until next time, game on.